Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to do an if you like this try that, specifically if you like Apothecary Diaries, there's a chance you'll like these as well. I know for myself, I have rewatched season 1 of Apothecary Diaries, I'm all caught up with season 2, I am eagerly awaiting every single episode from now on of season 2. Maybe when season 2 is over, if I really can't wait, I might have to jump into the light novels to know what happens. But in the meantime, while I'm waiting for each new episode to come out, I just keep finding myself rewatching scenes on YouTube. I keep sending my friends memes, and I thought, man, I need something else to scratch that itch, and I figured I'm not alone. So while I don't know what I'm gonna do, hopefully if you're like me and you need something that is at least somewhat like Apothecary Diaries, then hopefully there is something on this list that piques your interest and does scratch that itch. That said, we all come to Apothecary Diaries really loving different things about it, so I want to extrapolate certain features that I think really define Apothecary Diaries and find stories that fit within those. One of them is going to be stories that have similar plots and have a mystery component to them. Next, we're going to have books that have, or stories, because it's not just going to be books, it's books, anime, manga, TV shows, all sorts of different kinds of stories. But regardless, we're going to have primarily books, and the second category are going to be books that have characters that are at least somewhat like Mao Mao, because let's be real, she's the real reason I feel like most of us love it. But also, perhaps there are stories in this list that have some ships that somewhat resemble Mao Mao and Jinshi, so we're going to have ones that are kind of character-oriented, and at the end, we're going to have some that are slightly random, and we'll get into the specifics for why I'm recommending the random ones when we get to that point. Jumping into it and starting with one that has a very similar plot and a mystery component, and I actually think of the ones on this list, of which we have so many to get through, this one might be on paper the most similar to Apothecary Diaries. The thing that sets it apart and makes it different is that it doesn't have the funny moments the same way. This one's much more serious, but as I describe it, you absolutely will not need me to elaborate as to what makes it similar, and that would be a crane among wolves. The setup for this story is that you follow this young woman whose sister has been sold into what is essentially like this rear palace area, and she is meant to be a concubine for this emperor. And the main character wants to try and rescue her sister from this situation. In doing this, she ends up kind of joining forces with somebody who is a relative to the emperor and who is potentially going to be involved in staging some kind of coup, and they also somewhat live a double life where sometimes they have to disguise themselves in order to really reach out to other people on the outside, and other times they have to fulfill their role. And there is also somewhat of a murder mystery component as well, and so the characters are joining forces with a detective who also helps them try to solve these mysteries and figure out how they are relevant to the plot with the emperor and our character's kidnapped sister. While some of the stories today are going to have fantasy components, this one actually is just a mystery story within a historical setting. So that alone also makes it really similar. There is a difference in the setting itself, as this author has a tendency to really focus on stories that are set within Korea. So you're going to get a slightly different inspiration for the setting, but as noted, there are so many factors about this that very clearly you do not need me to go into detail as to why they're similar. It's pretty clear from the start. As said before, though, this is a little bit more on the serious side, so if you like Apothecary Diaries and you wouldn't mind something that maybe is very similar but you take the humor out of it and you feel like there's still a really great story in there, this one's definitely going to fulfill that. We will get into some that are a little bit more on the lighthearted side, but the next one is still maintaining something that's a little bit more serious, and that would be A Song to Drown Rivers. Once again, we're looking at a more historical setting. This one technically does have a little bit of fantasy elements, but the way the fantasy elements are woven into the story, it kind of borders on some of the suspicions that people have within Apothecary Diaries, their fear that maybe there's a ghost or something of that sort. So you are going to see that the fantasy components in this feel like they could fit right into Apothecary Diaries. The setup for this one, though, is that you have a character who really hates the way that a certain group has sort of conquered her country and taken over, and the way that her people have been treated. She hates it, but she also happens to be extraordinarily beautiful, and somebody who is involved in politics sees the potential to basically make her a concubine to the ruler of the group that she does not like. He has the opportunity to become one of his concubines and then report information back to the individual that she maybe is starting to have feelings for. So there's a lot of moral grayness within the story as well, and you are exploring the ways that she has her view a certain way based off of the experiences in her life, but that is starting to have a different effect now that she gets to know a little bit more, and she's getting involved with what I'm going to call the court intrigue, and she just sees that there's all these different factions that are kind of going up against each other, and she's caught in the middle of it, and she has to decide for herself where she stands. Next up, we have some that are all fantasy, but they absolutely represent that sort of lighthearted mystery feeling that so many of us love within Apothecary Diaries, and those would be The God and the Gumiho, The Tainted Cup, and Jackaby. The Tainted Cup is a bit of a booktube darling, so within this story, it's sort of like Sherlock Holmes meets fantasy, and what I think really especially ties this a little bit to Apothecary Diaries is this story absolutely has characters filled with eccentricities. There is a murder mystery at the core, but there's obviously a greater plot going on in the background that as the story progresses, you're very much seeing hints that it's going to become a little bit more rooted in those bigger events. And then also the main reason why I really wanted to bring this one up is there's so much to do with plant components in this and how it plays a role into the fantasy and the world building, and it's really cool. The idea is that people can have certain enhancements based off of the way they utilize plant properties in this, and the plant properties that they're utilizing come from these monsters whose bodies die, and then once they die and sort of settle in and rot, it creates a certain kind of plant life where it was left behind, and then that's what they're taking from those. And I thought that was so fascinating, but to have a murder mystery story with eccentric characters and also plant components to it and poison, perfect. Perhaps doesn't have as much of the intrigue factor, of course, but I do feel like there's a lot of other things about that one that make it a fun comparison. And then, as stated, I feel like Jackaby and The God and the Gumiho absolutely represent a mystery setting where you're kind of following these characters as they're trying to disentangle all of this web of clues. In Jackaby, this is much more taking the sorts of things that we see so often in fantasy, for example, things like fairies and elves and whatever you think of when you think classic folklore type of things, and you're exploring that within a more urban setting. I would say this is more steampunk Gaslamp, and you're following a character who she's just kind of come into her own. She's trying to find her place in society, and she's quite brilliant, and she ends up becoming the assistant to this very eccentric detective. So if you like that feeling, that just like fun following this quirky character as they're trying to figure out what is going on, but then you wouldn't mind there being some fantasy elements woven in, then Jackaby was really, really fun, and I think absolutely fulfilled that. As for The God and the Gumiho, while I don't necessarily think that they feel like Jinshi and Mao Mao necessarily, because the characters themselves absolutely represent different tropes and archetypes than Jinshi and Mao Mao do, the characters in The God and the Gumiho, there is a bit of romance as well. And on top of that, you have it's technically a modern-ish setting, so it's not exactly the same, but it's more so rooted in our world. And while there are fantasy components, they're more so fantasy components as far as the fact that the characters themselves are certain kinds of beings within mythology. So, for example, one of the characters is a fallen god, and the other character is a part fox type of character that you see in a lot of mythology. And these two end up working together despite the fact that they basically hate each other as they're trying to solve a mystery that turns out to have much bigger implications than they ever imagined. But these two really butt heads and do not get along, but also there's a lot of tension that might not just be based in them disliking each other. Maybe it's even the exact opposite. Next up, we have a middle grade story that is just so fun and delightful, and there are some parallels between the main character and Mao Mao, but I wanted to have this more so in this category as opposed to the characters category, and that would be A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. The setup for this story is that a lot of people have magic, but they have really borderline useless magical powers, and our main character is somebody who has the power to compel baked goods. So for example, she works in her family's bakery and she kind of compels the dough to rise and to not get burned and to basically be perfect and golden and flaky, and the dough often complies, and that is her power. It's not anything that she thinks could topple empires or save cities. It's just what it is. It's simple. And suddenly, though, it is these very powers that put her as the prime suspect to a murder when there is a dead body found in her family's bakery. So now she is suddenly finding herself at the center of what turns out to potentially be a much bigger conspiracy. And what starts out as kind of a silly, fun murder mystery turns into something much bigger. And what I think is the parallel between this character and Mao Mao is that this character, similar to Mao Mao, has an understanding of, and I feel like this is going to sound terrible, but almost like their place in society. Not that I think we as the viewer think that they should have that place, because most of us love Mao Mao and we're like, she can rule the world. She can do whatever she wants. We love her. But I also think that it speaks to their settings and their view of themselves and how they navigate the world. They have this understanding that I am not, quote unquote, exceptional. I just know what I know and I'm good at what I do. And I don't want anybody to really take notice of me necessarily. And I think that there is a little bit of a parallel between the main character in this and Mao Mao. As noted, this is middle grade, or you could categorize it as the young end of young adult. So it's got much more of a youthful feel, but it's so fun. And if you like the idea of a capable main character with a fun murder mystery, you're going to get that in this story. Switching now to stories that have some similarities between the characters, specifically Mao Mao, and the ship between Mao Mao and Jinshi. So the first one is one of my top recommendations from all of these books and these stories, and that would be The Downstairs Girl. Very, very clear parallels to Apothecary Diaries. This might be one of my highest recommendations if you're looking to scratch the itch. So the setup for the story is that you follow this young woman who, it is a historical setting, it's not fantasy, and she is an Asian American young woman in America at a time when you are seeing women fighting for the right to vote and to have more freedom. However, because of her race, a lot of women who are sort of leading the charge, you could say, or they feel they're leading the charge, they think that she holds them back because of the fact that she is not white. So you are seeing, similar to in Apothecary Diaries, where this is sort of challenging of hierarchies, you're seeing this character who, once again, I feel bad using this terminology, but they sort of understand their current place in society, even though it's undeserved and nobody should be treated this way. They sort of navigate life as it presents itself. However, they are so capable, they're so exceptional, and in this case, this character is wonderfully charming, and she, through some unique circumstances, has the ability to start writing what is basically a column in this newspaper of sorts. And she's so witty and she is fantastic, and she starts giving advice to people, and some of the advice is really heartwarming. Some of it kind of speaks to the very empowerment that a lot of people are striving toward, and she is representing the cause, and she can do so from this place because people don't know that she's the one that is writing it. And then other times she sasses people and it's delightful. There is also a really lovely romantic subplot in this that is great. And another parallel to Apothecary Diaries that not too many of the rest of these are going to explore is understanding her family dynamics and sort of her origin. And I don't want to say too much else, but you could almost argue there's a mystery with that. And it definitely reminded me of some of what you got with an Apothecary Diaries. So this is one that has serious undertones, but also maintains this lighter air. As noted, probably one of my top recommendations if you want something similar to Apothecary Diaries in a lot of ways. Next up, we have The Red Palace. This is the other story that is written by the same author who wrote A Crane Among Wolves, and both of these have a mystery component. I could have had this in the mystery category. However, I actually felt like there were other pieces of this that, if you like Mao Mao and Jinshi, and if you like Mao Mao in general, then I actually think that this one fits in this category a little bit better. So the setup for this one is that, once again, you're looking at there are social hierarchies, and there is somebody in a position of power who's being accused of murdering someone. And so our main character, she finds herself sort of, in a sense, wrapped up in all this because culturally there are a lot of rules to who can examine bodies, and some of it has to do with the gender of the person doing the examining as well as the person who has died. And so that is how you kind of see our main character fit into the picture, as she is somebody who is being roped into helping solve this murder. And some of the people that are alongside her, one of them happens to be somebody who is sort of like this official character, and they're more like an investigator. So you kind of have a mix of Jinshi Mao Mao roles within both these characters, but not necessarily perfectly representing them, because I definitely feel like the other one I mentioned, A Crane Among Wolves, is a little bit closer to what you see with them, a more one-to-one, whereas this, you're seeing pieces of them in these characters. I loved the romantic subplot in this. I loved the mystery. I felt like I was learning while I read this, and that's another thing I think so many of us love Apothecary Diaries for, is you're like, wow, that's fascinating. And I felt like that reading this as well. I felt like I was really learning about history and the cultural differences that I had no idea about. And there is a little bit of court intrigue as well in this. So I actually think this is also, once again, a really fantastic similar comparison. On the back, you can see one of the other characters. It's great. Both of these, both of those, I'm like, do I need to reread them? Just so that I could get that fulfillment of something like Apothecary Diaries. I kind of feel like I need to. Next up, though, when I was thinking, who do I feel like represents the ship? Because in both of those, you have capable main characters that are somewhat staying in their lane, but they're getting roped into things through their areas of expertise, but maybe they're kind of reluctantly doing so. And also there are romantic subplots I like, but I just didn't feel like the characters in their archetypes really represented Mao Mao and Jinshi. And I was like, who does? Let me think of a character who is capable and who is pragmatic and who doesn't seem to mind hard work and seems compassionate, but in a way that borders on almost apathy sometimes, because they're not so outwardly kind and they don't necessarily show their feelings all the time. So who's a character that represents that? And then who's an eccentric, beautiful character who just seems to bask in the adoration from others? And I was like, oh, Howl and Sophie from Howl's Moving Castle. I have the book here, but of course the movie is a perfect representation of this as well. When it comes to characters that I feel like have some similarities between Jinshi and Mao Mao in their dynamics, I absolutely feel that these characters do. I don't even know if I need to say too much else. Obviously the plots are nowhere near the same, but if you just want more of that feeling of characters like that, Howl's Moving Castle, I can't think of too many other stories that fit those characters better. Next up, abandoning the idea of the ship and solely focusing on a character that is beloved and who is very, very capable and who has their own little obsessions, and they're just kind of navigating life in their own way. They're sort of cutting their own path. I wanted to find a character who I felt like really did that in a way that's similar to Mao Mao, and I couldn't think of too many characters that represent that better than Frieren from Frieren Beyond Journey's End. Obviously, this is an anime that is coming out around the same time as Apothecary Diaries, so I think a lot of people inevitably are finding themselves comparing these two characters, and there's a part of me that's really happy to see that so many people, the reason we're comparing them is not trying to, I know they're fictional, but we're not pitting them against each other to try to see which one's the best. It's more so people like to analyze these characters because they like to ask, what is it about these characters that make them so loved? Why do we feel so attached to them? What is it that makes them so exceptional? And when you break it down, a lot of the things are really similar between Frieren and Mao Mao, and I kind of laid it out. They're both very capable. They both maybe aren't the norm in their society as far as how they see the world, how they go through life, but they are doing so in a way that feels very fitting to them. And I think a lot of people can really connect with the fact that these characters have likes and dislikes, and they feel like they have their own personalities, and they don't necessarily fit within some specific character type or trope. They just are who they are, and they feel really different than what we typically get because they're not trying to fulfill some kind of marketing, or they just are well fleshed out characters. And I feel like they're both kind of a little bit eccentric in the best of ways, and as stated, they're both exceptionally capable. I do want to note, I think the further into Apothecaries we get, the more you're starting to see Mao Mao take on a role of almost like mentorship, especially with her friend. She's so sweet with her, but once again, I say sweet because looking at it, she is sweet, but I don't know if most of us would initially categorize her behavior as such, because it doesn't show and manifest in the same way other sweet characters' sweetness does. But she absolutely is looking out for other people, and she's caring, but she almost doesn't seem to realize that's what she's doing. And I feel like Frieren, in a weird way, does the exact same thing. I mean, you see her take on mentor-like roles within the story, and she's always like patting this other character's head, and they're just adorable. And I love seeing them kind of come into these roles as they navigate through the story. It's a parallel between these two that I don't see discussed as often, but I just love both those characters. So if you are looking for a character that you're like, I love Mao Mao, who else is as awesome and great as Mao Mao? I think Frieren definitely fits that. You can watch the anime or you can get into the manga. They're very close to each other. Now getting into one that I feel like is the perfect bookend to these first two categories, as it actually in some ways represents both. There is absolutely a murder mystery plotline, and it's actually one of the things that's sort of a catalyst that pushes everything forward. But on top of that, you do have certain roles for the characters that is similar to Mao Mao and Jinshi. However, there's a bit of a role reversal. So the book would be Descendant of the Crane. And the setup for this is that you follow a young woman whose father has recently died, and he was somebody who is in a position of power. She is now finding herself in a position of power. She sort of is reluctant towards this. She's not somebody who feels ready whatsoever for this position. She doesn't necessarily even really want it in the same way that you see maybe from other characters in other stories. But on top of that, she doesn't think that her father's death has been explored enough. She thinks he was murdered, and she really wishes somebody would look into it, and she figures, well, I'm the one with the power now. If I want somebody to look into this, I guess I have to make it happen. So she ends up recruiting somebody from outside of the courts because she's looking for somebody who can help her in a way where it doesn't feel like they're somebody that she has to worry about. Can I trust them? Can I not trust them? Do they have their own personal reasons for why they might tell me one thing or the next? So she recruits somebody from the outside to assist her, and this person has an area of expertise. While not necessarily in poisons and apothecary-like things, they do have some area of expertise that is relevant to this mystery, as they're more so rooted in things like law. So our character recruits them. So it's kind of like, what if Jinshi recruited somebody to help them solve a mystery? Because this character in this is kind of like the Jinshi type as far as their position within the court. And also, I just in general think the fact there's the murder mystery side of things, it kind of is a mix of a little bit of a lot of different pieces of Apothecary Diaries. The last category is the random category. This is mostly rooted in structure. So what I mean by that is I definitely think Apothecary Diaries almost deceptively has this impression of, we're just a small murder mystery of the week sort of feel. And then you start to realize, oh no, the stakes are much bigger than that. And there's so much that's actually really connected, and it gets bigger and bigger, and the stakes get bigger and bigger. So I wanted to mention a couple stories where I feel like that's very true, where you go into it thinking it's something smaller and then it expands. And there's one other one that the reason that it is within the random category is that I actually wanted to put it as kind of a similar Descendant of the Crane. It's kind of like a combination of the first two categories. However, I'm not done with it yet. So it's kind of an honorable mention, but the similarities were enough that I felt like I had to at least mention it. So I'll go ahead and start with that one. And that would be The Councillor. This is very much a political intrigue type of story. You're following a character who recently has been appointed councillor and has to decide who is going to take the place of the late queen. And she does not want this role. She hasn't really felt like she's necessarily the right person for the role, but she also knows that she is very capable. So she does what she can to make it happen. However, she's kind of looked down upon by a lot of other people that are part of nobility. And she's somebody who came from outside of the court. She's somebody who actually previously was an orphan. And she has a lot of understanding with history. The queen called her the girl with the quill because she's very scholarly and she's absolutely brilliant. And she picks up on a lot of details, and she really is scrutinizing people constantly and trying to figure out what caused the late queen's death, as it doesn't really seem as clear and cut as they're telling everybody. And on top of all of that, she is somebody who has an interest in poison. She might even do things to herself similar to Mao Mao to kind of experience the feelings of such things. It is slightly different in how she uses it than Mao Mao does, but I felt like, okay, there's definitely some overlap between a lot of what's going on here and what we see in Apothecary Diaries. And then now getting into the ones that are more structurally similar, we have Yona of the Dawn as well as Race the Sands. Race the Sands starts out, it's not going to sound similar at all, it starts out as a story where you are following somebody who in this fantasy world is a coach to individuals who race these things called Keyhawks, which are reincarnated evil people, basically. And then they race these monsters, and it's this very dangerous, basically cutthroat sport. Once again, does not seem like there would be any overlap whatsoever. However, the story where it starts, you just kind of think like, oh, it's going to be like a mentor-mentee setup. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's so much intrigue. And it goes all the way to the emperor. And you're starting to get into like the religious figures. And it just seems like it starts out small and then it turns into something you would never guess was as big as it is. And there's a lot of intrigue in this. So while it might not seem that similar at first, I feel like it really is a satisfying build. And then last, Yona of the Dawn. We follow a character who has been ousted from her role, basically, after her father was murdered, and she is trying to claim her throne, but in order to claim it, she knows she needs to build, basically, an army, or at the very least, she needs to gain allies, and so she seeks out these people with ancient dragon powers, and it starts out just feeling like, oh, okay, so you're following this girl as she's trying to get her throne back. But then it, once again, similar to what I was describing about Race of Sands, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's so many more implications than her situation initially would imply. On top of that, if you want a setup between two characters where the main character is just like, I have to keep going with this plot, and then the love interest is like, I'm totally obsessed with you, the characters in this. You absolutely are getting a character that is obsessed with Yona in a way that's not so dissimilar to Chinchi and how obsessed he clearly is with Mao Mao. I would love to know if you have any of your own recommendations. Feel free to leave them, and they can be within the categories I mentioned, or if there's something that you just feel like is similar for a variety of different reasons, feel free to mention those as well. I will have links to all of these in the description bar in case you'd like to check them out. Thanks so much for watching. If you are interested in more Apothecary Diaries content, I will have my playlist linked. As noted though, thanks for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.